tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got interested into this subject.
Well, I think I became interested in the subject when I was a young child and I first conceived of the notion of death. That, basically myself and my mommy and my daddy and everyone I knew or loved was going to die and be buried in the dirt. And it was quite devastating to me to come to that realization. So pretty much since then, though my quest got more sophisticated as I got older, pretty much since that time, I wanted to get to the bottom because of, is there a spiritual reality? Is death indeed the final end, or is it a new beginning? Is there a spiritual realm, as so many people had, spoken of? I grew up in New York City. It's a melting pot of cultures and religions, and didn't matter which friend's home I was at, whether they were Jewish or Christian or Muslim or Hindu, because I think I had friends of every faith, more or less. They all prayed at dinner time before a meal, or, spoke of God in some way, praised God, etc. There was always mention as a child, and I was like, all right, everybody believes in this big boss up in the sky, so there was no reason for me not to believe. And as I got older, I questioned more, and then I decided that of all the, let's say, faiths out there, of all the different paradigms that were offered, the one that I felt made the most sense was the scientific paradigm. Here was an ideology which seemed to be tried and tested. And whereas faith offered, different religions offered various tales and myths that you had to you had to accept on blind faith and could never really be tested, with the workings of science. I flip a switch and the lights go on. So it seemed to be pretty well tested. And moreover, none of the religions I had studied ever gave us any real technology. I mean, other than the tales which we're supposed to believe in, regardless of what religion you believe in, none of them have ever offered us something that either, a medicine that extended our lives or cured a disease. There were blessings that were supposed to cure diseases, but really until the age of science, the mortality rate for humans all across the globe was like half of what it is now. So I put my faith in science, and as I did more and more research, I found myself coming up with the science of what's called sociobiology, which is sort of a modern day twist on Darwinism. And basically, what sociobiology suggests, it's just modern genetics, which is that basically any trait that is universal to any species has to have a genetic component. So, for instance, the fact that all dogs bark, or all cats meow, or all beavers build dams, or all honeybees build hexagonal-shaped honeycombs, or basically any species that you study has a very specific way of how it eats, how it grooms itself, how it reproduces, etc. Moreover, if I took a cat, or a kitten rather, away from its mother at birth and raised it to humans, it's still going to grow up to meow, suggesting that it's not a learned behavior, but a genetically preconceived reflex. So, according to the science of sociobiology, any behavior that's universal, so for instance, the fact that all cats meow would suggest that somewhere in a cat's brain is a series of neural connections that generates that particular behavior, meowing. And were we to damage that part of the cat's brain, it would probably lose its ability somehow, just like with humans. If there are language parts of our brain that if damaged, we lose our language abilities. So any trait that's universal, it suggests that there's a part of the brain that generates that behavior, and then that there are genes in our chromosomes that are responsible for creating that series of connections in the brain. So I applied that notion to the fact that every human culture from the beginning of our species has believed in some form of a spiritual reality. That every culture has created a religion, has created a series of myths, all based on a belief in some higher power, some higher plane. So, applying that notion to this science of sociobiology, what it suggested to me was, perhaps in fact, humans are genetically hardwired to believe in some type of a spiritual reality. And that just like we're a linguistic animal, we have parts of our brain that give us the ability to communicate linguistically through symbolic language. We can take combinations of sounds that symbolically represent things. No other animal has that ability. They might tweet and chirp and make noises, but we have symbolic language. And there are parts of the brain that give us these abilities, the Broca's area, the Wernicke's area, the angular gyrus, etc. So just like we're predisposed for language, at the same time, nobody is born speaking English or French or German. So as a species, we're predisposed to communicate through a language, and each culture, based on its environment, its own particular reality, comes up with its own language. So I applied these notions to the fact that every culture has had a religion, has believed in something, suggesting that humans are genetically predisposed to a belief system. So I thought about it and was like, well, that's kind of compelling, but, why? And then I thought, well, why would we have evolved this, first of all? It's a very strange trait. No other species has it. So I thought about, well, what makes humans unique? What makes us different from the other species that might be a clue as to why we would have developed what I now believe is this spiritual function, a series of connections in the brain that compels humans to believe that there's something greater than ourselves. And as I thought about it, I thought, well, we're a musical animal, we're a mathematical animal, we're a linguistic animal. Those things make us unique from all the other species, but the thing that makes us the most unique is self-conscious awareness. Now, in terms of evolutionary theory, self-conscious awareness, hands down, made us the most powerful species on Earth. That was the trait that really turned things around, because what it gave us was the power of self-modification. So, for instance, if we get hit with let's say the Earth, tilts on its axis 1 degree, and the Earth goes into another ice age, which it tends to do every 100,000 years. Rather than, unlike all the other species who have to sit back passively, and as the temperature drops, they have to wait through the process of natural selection to develop a thicker coat of fur. Humans, because we have self-conscious awareness, can say, I am cold, and we can do something about it. Within an hour, we can sew ourselves a coat of fur, as opposed to having to wait, 1,000,000 years and 1,000 generations later to, have developed a thicker coat of fur through evolution. So in a sense, we've sort of broken away from the process of natural selection. Humans are not going to evolve anymore. Anyone who speculates, what will humans be in 500 years? We'll have 3 years and we'll be taller, and, whatever they project is silly. Humans aren't evolving. All the other animals might, but humans won't, because we can adjust ourselves to suit any environment, any climate that we visit. We can alter. We can alter ourselves, or through technology, we can make ourselves a suit so we can go walk on the moon, for instance. However, so here's this great trait, self-conscious awareness, makes us the most powerful animal on Earth, except the only thing was, the drawback was, we became the first animal to be aware of our own inevitable deaths. No other animal knows that it's going to die. They don't have a sense of their future that way. If they see a threat, they're driven to either fight or flee to survive, but they don't know the outcome is oh no, if I lose this fight, I'm a goner. So all of a sudden humans now, because of self-conscious awareness, realize that one day we're not going to exist. And what I believe is that the terror of that awareness was so overwhelming to our species that basically nature had to select, through the process of evolution, nature had to select a cognitive modification, something that would allow us to be able to survive even among self-conscious awareness, knowing that we're going to die. That the anxiety created by that awareness basically made us what Freud called the neurotic animal. And so what I believe happened was, over time, nature selected this, again, cognitive modification, sort of added to our brains a series of connections that compels us to have this sensibility that we look outward and we believe and we feel that there's something else out there, that there's something greater than ourselves. And as a result, we believe that there's the spiritual realm in the universe. We believe it's a universal. Every culture has believed that that humans are comprised of some part of the spiritual realm, that basically that we possess a soul, that there's a part of the spiritual reality built into us, so that when we die, when our physical bodies die, again, every culture believes that this soul will continue on in some form. And what I suggest is that ultimately spirituality and religiosity are evolutionary adaptations that were selected into us as a coping mechanism to enable us to survive our unique awareness of death. So that's the basic premise of the God part of the brain.
Something that I have always asked my guest, are we evolving or devolving as a human species?
Well, if you recall, what I just said was humans are not going to, at least physically, we are not going to change at all. We're not going to have a new finger or gills or anything. Anything that people we're not going to have bigger heads and like our hair is going to fall off and we'll have bigger skulls because we'll have bigger brains. None of that's going to happen. Mm-hmm. As I said, because basically we're not going to change. We'll change our environment. Our environment no longer changes us. If it gets cold, if there's an ice age and the temperature drops 100 degrees, most of the species will die off, except those with thicker coats of fur. And those will evolve, and there'll be new species with thicker coats of fur, just like in the last ice age, we had the woolly mammoth and the saber-toothed tiger, etc. Those animals will evolve. They will change as the climate changes or the environment changes, whether it be the climate or the pollutants we put into the earth. All these things lend to natural selection. But humans, because of self-conscious awareness, as I was saying, we're not going to evolve. We're done. If it gets colder, we'll just pump the heat up. We'll build shelters that are made to keep us warmer in those kind of extreme temperatures. I mean, who knows? In 500 years, humans might be living in some strange climate where there are these heated areas to help us deal with the cold, or who knows what. But basically, we'll change. We will recreate our environment to suit us. Humans are not evolving or devolving, at least physically. Now, socially, hopefully, we are evolving. And through the course of human history, there has been an evolution of the human mind. Our species has changed. Initially we were a nomadic animal. 100,000 years ago, humans had to follow the food supply. We would pick all the fruits and vegetables in a certain area, and then we'd have to move on. And then about 12,000 years ago, it occurred to us for the first time that, where a seed fell, a new plant came up. And for the first time, humans began to, was called the agricultural revolution. We began to start the first farmlands, and then we had the first settled communities. Now humans didn't have to travel around for food. So in that way, again, we evolved, and we're continuing to evolve. We're evolving politically. We've gone from a species that mostly worked on having like some monarch, one brutal dictator who by sheer force would lead the nation, and then we worked our way over the course of time, to our aristocracy, and then eventually to a democracy. So,
Yeah.
so socially and intellectually, humans will definitely continue to evolve. There will be, even in the last 25 years, humans have socially and culturally evolved just as a result of the internet. We're a different species now intellectually than we were 50, 25 years ago, because of what the internet has done, the flow of information and the ability to communicate instantly with everyone all the time. So in that regard, we are evolving. The more information that flows out there, the more exposure people have to different types of information, we will continue to expand our horizons. So like in the past, there were cultures, they didn't even have access to another culture. If you were raised in some like Mormon ranch out in the middle of Utah, you might not have even known there was such a thing as a Muslim or a Jew or a Hindu. You grew up in this little compound, but now information is out there. It doesn't matter what religion you were born to, what sexual orientation, everything is out there. All of the possibilities are out there, and that will change how humans think and how they behave. So my answer to that question is, culturally and socially, we are, for the most part, evolving, but physically, we're done.
Where do these genes come from that give us this hardwiring?
Well, I mean, all of our cognitive traits come from genes that develop the hard wiring. So basically, the chromosome is the molecule that's responsible for giving the information to when the fetus is developing for everything to develop. So somewhere in the chromosome, there's information that tells the body to build hands and fingers and a nervous system and a heart, etc. So it's like somewhere in there's what we could call like the heart genes. So somewhere in there, I mean, there's the gene's a very complex molecule. They're just beginning to get a sense of it. They definitely do not have pinned down, they can't look on a human chromosome and say, see these genes here, those make us musical. Like these are the genes that create the part of the brain that enable us to play an instrument or to respond to music. So that can't be answered. Like, where are the genes in the human chromosome that make us spiritual? One couldn't say. But what we can say is we are learning now which parts of the brain are responsible for generating spiritual consciousness. So, for instance, they're now taking people in the midst of like meditation or prayer and of different religions and putting them in an MRI. And while they're having what they call a spiritual experience, they're turning them MRI on, and we can now see what happens in the brain when someone feels like they've transcended, when they feel like they're having a spiritual or mystical experience. If someone's praying or meditating, so they've studied cultures from the East, meditating, they've studied cultures from the West, praying, different religions. And for instance, what they've found is that, first of all, when we have a spiritual experience, and I say these things in quotes, there are symptoms that are universally define the experience. So no matter what religion you believe in, no matter what culture you come from, when asked to describe a spiritual experience, people say the same things. They say, for instance, that you feel a sense of overwhelming euphoria, tranquility, relaxation. You feel a loss of normal boundaries of time and space, almost like this cosmic consciousness. You feel outside of your own self so that your normal ego boundaries are transcended. And what they find, for instance, is if you meditate or pray, your brain changes. So, for instance, your brain's amygdala, which is a part of what's called the limbic system, And the amygdala generates fear and anxiety. Whenever you have anxiety, that's the part of the brain that is operating. When you meditate or pray, that part of your brain gets a decreased blood flow. So you feel less anxiety. You feel relaxed. You feel tranquil. You feel a sense of bliss. So all of the symptoms of what we call a spiritual experience can now be connected to the region in the brain that, gives us that symptom. So for instance, another example is, as I suggested, in, every culture, when asked to describe a spiritual or mystical experience, they say a sense of timelessness and spacelessness. It's almost like you can't tell how much time has passed. A minute could feel like an hour, and an hour could feel like a minute. When you meditate or pray, your brain's parietal lobe, which generates temporal and spatial consciousness, also gets a decreased blood flow. So like our normal sense of time and space gets kind of blurry, and we get overwhelmed with these sensations. And because I'm suggesting that we're hardwired to believe that there's something else out there, we interpret these sort of euphoric experiences as being somehow connecting us to this other higher realm. So when we have a spiritual experience, we believe we've made contact with, the higher powers that we believe in, whether they be Zeus or Christ or Allah or Odin. And I know a lot of people would take offense at throwing their gods into the same forum or arena as all these other, supposedly false gods. But every religion believes that all the other gods are the false gods. So basically, depending on our culture, most people will have to at least recognize that the religion they believe in 99.9% of the time is the religion they were raised in. And had, for instance, any one of us been switched at birth, we'd be believing whatever it is we were newly taught. So, take, the Middle East, for instance, if you had in a community in Israel where the child of an Orthodox Jewish family was switched at birth with like a radical Islamic family, it's not like at age 13 or something, let's say the boy who was born to Jewish parents now being raised by Muslims, when he hits age 13, it's not like he's going to have some awakening and say, wait a second, shouldn't I be having a bar mitzvah or something? He's now Muslim. That's his new faith, and he will believe it with the same conviction he would have believed in the exact opposing faith, hating his now new self for his old beliefs. And all of our beliefs are malleable like that. We tend to believe because we need to believe, because it's that coping mechanism. Because without that coping mechanism, we all have to look death straight in the eye.
Exactly.
And that's a very painful thing to do. So, hey, nothing wrong with a little religion to sort of, ease the pain of that knowledge. And sometimes humans, drink and they do drugs. We're the only animal that does these things, that basically do drugs. It's because we need to. We need to alleviate the anxiety of this awareness. It plagues us daily. And we are a neurotic animal as a result of this awareness of death. And this was nature almost like pulling its straws to somehow keep us alive, given our intelligence. So it instilled in us what I call nature's white lie, this predisposition to believe in something that's actually, what I'm suggesting, not there. That basically spiritual reality is just the manifestation of the way humans think. It's like an inherited device that makes us more survivable because it allows us to cope with death. So it's just a survival mechanism. But ultimately what I'm suggesting is, you take out the human brain and no animal, unless there's extraterrestrial life that has ever conceived of the notion of a God before. So basically, without humans, there is no spiritual reality. It's just a manifestation of the way we're inherently wired to perceive reality. So what I'm suggesting is that there is no God, and there is no spiritual reality, and there is no soul, and there is no afterlife. There's just the physical realm. And that all of our beliefs are just the consequence of the way that we were born to perceive reality as a species. So basically that, in an essence, that's the essence of the theory.
Does the God part of the brain show any evidence to why people show cognitive dissonance when their beliefs and worldview is confronted or put to the test?
That's an excellent question. They've never really done experiments like that so far. But I would imagine, like with any cognitive dissonance, that there's going to be some reading in the brain. So if you tell someone, for instance, we have evidence that your spouse has been sleeping around, that moment your brain is going to change.
Yeah.
If you tell someone, hey, by the way, scientific research now suggests your God isn't real, your brain is going to change. It's going to mess with your head. It's literally going to change the chemical flow of your brain. You might find yourself horribly depressed. You tell someone that their spouse has been cheating, they could have been all happy and gleeful that day, and all of a sudden they're going to be on their knees bawling in tears, heartbroken. And that's an experience. So yes, our brain changes. And it's interesting what would happen. They've never done anything like that, but that's an interesting thought. What would happen if you confront people? Like, what's happening in their brain when their faith is challenged? So,
I guess you can say probably the same thing with the listeners that are probably listening to you right now. Like, okay, what is he talking about? Like their belief structure is being challenged right now, and they're probably showing cognitive dissonance while they're listening to you speak right now. But instead of going to buy your book, they would just rather say, "No, you're bogus and you're lying." That's a form of cognitive dissonance, and that shows no scientific explanatory reason of why they should seek more answers. Instead, they just want to say, "No, you're lying. It can't be true."
Well, some people, it depends.
I don't believe you.
Well, generally with people who hear my ideas, I have two responses. They either want to read more because they find it interesting, or they want to make a dartboard out of my face. So, this is the new science. This is the new science of religion. They're calling it neurotheology. It's sort of like, where in the brain religious belief comes from. I actually call it, in my book, I call it biotheology, because it's more than just the brain. It's also the genes. It's a genetic science. But the more they're doing experiments on near-death experiences, they now know the exact chemistry of a near-death experience, and they can simulate one, in a lab by basically increasing one of the neurotransmitters in the brain is called glutamate. When your body isn't getting enough oxygen, the brain starts secreting glutamate, and that triggers a near-death experience. So for instance, and what it does is it relaxes us, but it triggers the optic nerve, so we get the white light, and all of these things. Every aspect of religiosity is starting to be reduced now to the chemistry in the brain. And it's funny because for those who are religious, they want the benefits of science. If they get sick, they're not going to their local priest to be cured. Hey, Father, my kid has cancer. Can you bless him? The priest will say, take him to the hospital right now. What, are you crazy? But the same science that gives us all of our cures, all of our medicine that we all use every day, the same science that gave us all of the technologies we use in our household, from electricity to our computer to our telephone to our TV, is the same science that has given us evolution and evolutionary theory. It's all based in biology. You can't go and get your measles shot and then say, I don't believe in evolution. People do all the time. But, so yeah, for those who are open-minded enough to maybe expand their horizons, or for those who maybe already have, I think, I've been told that it's a great read. It's been written up by Pulitzer Prize winners and Nobel Science winners and prize winners, and and it's there's a lot of science in there, but I do a good job of making all of these concepts very accessible to the reader. So my idea wasn't like, here, let me talk over everybody's head, like a lot of textbooks do. It was more like, let's make these ideas make sense to people, because that's what ideas should do. So just as I'm explaining these concepts on the phone, for those who are open-minded, I think they'll find at least an entertaining read in the God part of the brain. So
yeah, I have somebody in the chat room that is saying these people are just experiencing chemical reactions in the brain, and that's pretty much all it is. And serotonin is one, and she mentioned MDMA. What is that?
These are just neurotransmitters. Like serotonin is a neurotransmitter. There are chemicals that the brain releases that basically triggers our thoughts. It's sort of like the chemistry of thought. And if your brain is secreting too much of one, you might get depression, or too little of one, and you might find yourself manic. So basically all of our perceptions, all of our thoughts, all of our emotions are controlled by the wiring in the brain and the chemistry of the brain. And that ultimately all perception is coming from the brain. So pretty much at any given point in your life, your brain is, if you could chart what's happening in your brain, you'd see it, you'd see the spectrum of color moving all over the place. Mm-hmm. So anything you sense, whether you smell something, see something, your brain is just lighting up constantly, doing, trillions of connections going off at once to make one complete reality for us that makes sense, that makes us a survivable creature. So yes, I agree with the person in the chat room that all perception is chemistry. That is one of the fundamental concepts behind the book.
If we didn't have this part in the brain that makes us spiritual, believe in the afterlife or God, etc., would we be a more advanced race here on Earth instead of creating wars, hatred, racism, division, etc.?
Well, that's also an excellent question. What I suggest is, see, when humans, again, when we were first evolving, there weren't that many of us. We were these like small nomadic communities, and probably very rare that we would even bump into one another. We were always going, man was spreading over all the continents. And again, we were this nomadic animal, now suffering this horrible anxiety, needing this coping mechanism, so men worshipped and prayed. However, one of the problems is, as we've evolved as a species, we've continued to populate. And now you've got all these differing religious beliefs all piled up on top of one another. And basically, there's no way that your religion can be right and mine can be right too. So every belief system basically represents a threat to every other belief system, which is why the history of man, is tainted with a history of religious war, of people, as you said, being intolerant and discriminating against one another. And this is one of the basic instincts of man, to form into a tribe and to protect that tribe and to, basically, find the enemy. And the enemy is that which doesn't believe what you believe. So, absolutely. Now, the thing is, here's the catch. We need it. We need it to survive. And we needed it when we first evolved. And I believe that it's probably impossible, since it's this instinct that we all have, to some degree. Now, that's another part of, I'll discuss that as well, but for the most part, humans as a species are compelled to believe. So religion will never go away, but if we're smart, if we want to be smart about it, we're going to have to sort of come to terms where we accept some type of like world order, some type of spiritual brotherhood. Or maybe we can all just sort of agree to disagree and not necessarily have to kill someone in the name of your God. But somehow we're going to have to come up with a strategy that's going to prevent us from continuing this type of tribal religious warfare, because as we see, especially with like, the advancement of human weaponry and the mass proliferation of all sorts of weapons, including of mass destruction, humans are not going to be around too much longer if we continue on this line. I mean, nuclear weapons have only been on this planet for like 50 years. So, given the history of man, that's not a very long time. And in another 50 years, probably 3 times the number of countries that have them now are going to have them. It's just a matter of time before people start using them, before they get into the wrong hands of just some terrorist group. But if we continue at this same line without figuring out a way to work things out, we are definitely a doomed species. So,
what is the extent of the God module? Does it explain all manifestations of spirituality or religion?
Pretty much. I mean, it can explain everything from, again, near-death experiences, basic religious belief, the universality of religious belief. So basically, every single religion follows certain universal patterns. Every religion has a birth ritual by which the infant is brought into the spiritual community through some sacred rite. They have a puberty ritual. There's a marriage ritual and a death ritual. So there are certain, again, these universals, and they're all just they manifest in every single culture because our brains are all kind of more or less wired the same. So pretty much this, as you called it, God module or series of connections in the brain, pretty much is responsible for almost all human religious behavior, even the desire for martyrdom. Martyrdom is a universal that's existed in some form in every culture. That basically when you're in the midst of religious war, people will give their lives in the name for their God or for their religious community. So that was probably part of the mechanism too, to give us something that gave us so much passion that we would actually give our own lives to save the community, because we're a social animal and we're wired to work for the greater order as much as for ourselves.
What would you say to someone who has had a near-death experience and they claim to have seen people in the room working on them and also seeing a light at the end of the tunnel? What would you say to them?
Well, I would say that, what they have found on their research on near-death experiences, for instance, that the light at the end of the tunnel, or the bright light that people tend to see, is that the glutamate, the neurotransmitter that's being secreted in the brain, affects the optic nerve, which becomes inflamed, and you just basically have this white flare. So in the midst of that, and the point of a near-death experience is to calm us, because our brains secrete glutamate when we have low oxygen levels in the brain. So, for instance, if you cut yourself and you're losing blood, your brain's going to get less oxygen. Instead of your heartbeat increasing, your body wants you to relax, to mellow out, and not lose so much blood. So that's the point of a near-death experience. And what it does is we're now filled with that comfort of feeling the connection to, our gods, whatever religion we believe in. And people of every culture have near-death experiences. So if you go to Saudi Arabia, anyone who has one will say that they saw Allah, whereas a Christian will be like, I saw Christ on the cross, and a Jew will say he saw Moses or God. And if you went back in time in ancient Greek during a near-death experience, was like, no, I know it was real. I saw Zeus standing right above me. Mm-hmm. So, basically it's a mechanism that's meant to comfort us, provide us with relief, and allow us to our heart rates to slow down. which is why near death, it happens when you almost died. You were in a car accident or something. So, and yes, people will claim that they know they saw these things. They felt this experience. They've done studies with, for some reason, part of it is also that we have this dissociative experience, which is we feel like we can look down on ourselves. Now, we all can imagine what a room might look like and what, so it's a form of a hallucination. But what they did an experiment in this one hospital where right above the bed, like 3 feet above the bed, they had a shelf that came out at the front of the bed where the person's head was underneath. And on top of the shelf, they had words on it, or numbers, or some code. And basically afterwards, when people would say, like, I had a near-death experience, I watched the whole thing, I was looking down, they'll say, well, what did the shelf say? And they'll be like, the shelf? The shelf said something? Like, no one has ever answered that question. So it's just a hallucination. We can, in our imagination, we feel separated from the world. We feel detached. We're basically, our brains are secreting endorphins, endogenous morphines. So we're like in this euphoric high, and that's all it is. It's a type of a hallucination, and it feels that real. That a lot of people will believe, like, no, I know I felt that. I know I was outside of my body, but yeah. Unfortunately, they weren't.
I'm going to go to a little more conspiratorial on this next question, but do the elite of the world know that we have these psychological problems, and they use these problems to have more control over us to help fulfill their agendas? Because they understand that we have these psychological issues, and we're blinded by our own faith.
The leaders of the world, you're saying?
Yeah. Yes.
Unfortunately, I wish the leaders of the world were that clever. They are stuck in their own problems and their own issues and their own biological, condition. Basically, we're all trying to deal with the fear of death in our own desperate ways, whether that means to try to gain power, as if somehow that'll, will rise above death that way, or to leave a legacy of power, that they'll have a bridge named after them or something, and somehow that gives us a sense of consolation, even though we know we're going to die. But I don't believe that, sure, like in the world of advertising and marketing, they know how humans think, and they're good at selling us products and making us buy crap. And sure, these same people who are marketing specialists work for politicians. So they're trying to give them notions of like, well, how do we get people to believe what you want them to, or just basically to vote for you? So, they're good at coming up with catchy slogans or catchy words, or, they tell them everything from what tie to wear. So to an extent, the world leaders are trying to use whatever psychological prowess they have to manipulate us so they can keep themselves in power. But I don't think they're that sophisticated that they're all getting together and trying to like sort of manipulate us in any way. I think basically they're all engaged in the same game that the rest of us are.
Yeah. I understand that we're through an evolutionary process, but is the brain neuromechanism from a couple thousand years ago the same neuromechanism of our brains today?
Well, that's a good question too. Basically, what defines a species is that the chromosomes are the same, that they have the same DNA, and therefore the same parts. The human genome, the human DNA, has been the same for about 100,000 years. And even though we've evolved culturally, so like we're not this nomadic animal anymore, we have these civilizations, etc., the basics, like if you took a child from 80,000 years ago away from like its nomadic parents back in time, and you like put it through a time warp and brought it to the present and raised it, it would fit in like you or me. We're the same animal. So basically we are Homo sapien is our animal, and Homo sapien, we have not evolved, we haven't changed. So yes, the brain, our brains are pretty much the same.
Okay, you said about 100,000 years ago, and that ties in with a lot of other researchers' theories too, like the missing link and other things too. But what sparked this advanced? I don't know how to really say it properly, but what sparked our DNA to become more advanced beings? Because it seems like, about 10,000 years ago, it seems like we started becoming more advanced beings here on Earth. Like,
right. Well,
what
but not right. Well, that wasn't a DNA thing, because again, we were already Homo sapien. That was a discovery thing. We are an animal, like even other animals. I mean, even chimps can learn.
Yeah.
Not as much as we can, obviously, but chimps can learn. Even a cat, can figure out. I mean, a mouse can figure out a maze, etc. So, all of the mammals have a big enough brain that they can figure things out. Humans have the biggest brain, or at least the most complex brain. We're the best at figuring things out. Even so, it took us about 90,000 years to figure out that the way that crops grew was through the fact that a seed falls into the earth and takes root and grows, and then it needs sunlight and water. So what happened was, that's why it's called the agricultural revolution. It was like a revolution to our species, but it was just us figuring something out. Just like we, figure out new things today about the brain or about computers. In the past, that was a new discovery. Just like at one point the wheel was a discovery, at one point planting a seed was a discovery. And that's what made the big change then all of a sudden we settled into communities, the first cities grew, the first cities became the first civilizations. So in terms of something like only going back 10,000 years, that's not a DNA thing. But if you go past 100,000 years, basically the evolution of the hominids, which was about 12 million years, from the first primate animal called prosimian, which was like an ape-like animal, which was branched off, and that lineage of an animal called prosimian was the creature, the primate, that in the next 12 million years evolved to becoming Homo sapien. And in between, there were all of these intermediary species. There was Australopithecus and Ramapithecus and Peking man and all these different creatures. They've given them all these different names. Some walked, eventually they began to walk more and more upright, and then their skulls got bigger because the brain started expanding. So that's the process of evolution.
What do your critics say about your research and your book?
Well, they can't really say much about the research because it's pretty well founded. I have tons of examples that anyone could Google. There's like genetic studies, like a study done on identical twins separated at birth. They did in University of Minnesota. They did 40,000 sets of twins, and they found that, for instance, twins separated at birth, identical twins have a 50% higher likelihood of having a similar religious conviction as opposed to fraternal twins separated at birth. So, like the questionnaire would say things like, well, how often do you pray? Does God play an important role in your life? If twins separated at birth, if one raised in New York said, yes, I'm very religious, I go to church, every Sunday, chances are it's 50% more likely that his identical twin raised completely differently also does the same thing, maybe for a different religion even, but is just as religious. So there's all sorts of, all of the science that I refer to is everything that they can look up in in a magazine, in a book, in a journal. They could Google it. It's all out there. So they haven't really condemned my research. I mean, then there are the creationists who just, anything that's research that supports evolution, they just say is a crock. They have no justification. There's no real support to their own theories. I I mean, if you ask them to show you the scientific evidence for the fact that, like, the Earth is 5,000 years old or whatever, and that that life was created in 7 days, you know, they've got nothing. They'll just say, well, it says it here in the Bible, and this is the Word of God, end of conversation. So, but, you know, I mean, sure, then I've got critics who just say, you know, well, you're going to burn in hell, end of conversation. But then I've had, you know, there are plenty of religious people out there who are open-minded and questioning and scratch their heads, and, you know, and I've even gotten letters from people who said they were very religious and they read the book and it made enough sense that they began to question things, and now they're more secular. So,
speaking of some of the science that you're talking about, explain to us what the transcranial magnetic stimulator is.
Okay. Honestly, I don't even, that's something that supports my theory, but I don't even believe in it. It was something created by this guy, Dr. Persinger, who says that he's created a helmet that can send an electric stimulus to any region in the brain. And when he stimulates the temporal lobe, which is where they're finding that religious experience comes from, he says people have a religious experience. But I've known people who've put it on and it didn't do anything. What it does is it like hums. You put it, I've had it, I've put it on, and it hums, and there are certain things that trigger a meditative experience for us, like a humming. So so basically, so you feel like relaxed, and people probably are like, you know, it's almost like they go into this meditative experience, and they're like, yeah, it's triggering my spiritual lobe, but I don't believe in that technology. Personally, I think that he's a fraud. So even though it supports my idea, because he's saying he's stimulating the God part of the brain, that's one of the few pieces of research that I actually don't buy into. Give us the ability to communicate linguistically through symbolic language. We can take combinations of sounds that symbolically represent things. No other animal has that ability. They might tweet and chirp and make noises, but we have symbolic language. And there are parts of the brain that give us these abilities, the Broca's area, the Wernicke's area, the angular gyrus, etc. So just like we're predisposed for language, at the same time, nobody is born speaking English or French or German. So as a species, we're predisposed to communicate through a language, and each culture, based on its environment, its own particular reality, comes up with its own language. So I applied these notions to the fact that every culture has had a religion, has believed in something, suggesting that humans are genetically predisposed to a belief system. So I thought about it and was like, well, you know, that's kind of compelling, but you know, why? And then I thought, well, why would we have evolved this, first of all? Like, you know, it's a very strange trait. No other species has it. So I thought about, well, what makes humans unique? What makes us different from the other species that might be a clue as to why we would have developed what I now believe is this spiritual function, a combination, a series of connections in the brain that compels humans to believe that there's something greater than ourselves. And as I thought about it, I thought, well, we're a musical animal, we're a mathematical animal, we're a linguistic animal. You know, those things make us unique from all the other species, but the thing that makes us the most unique is self-conscious awareness. Now, in terms of evolutionary theory, self-conscious awareness, hands down, made us the most powerful species on Earth. That was the trait that really turned things around, because what it gave us was the power of self-modification. So, for instance, if we get hit with another, let's say the Earth, you know, tilts on its axis 1 degree, and the Earth goes into another ice age, which it tends to do every like 100,000 years. Rather than, unlike all the other species who have to sit back passively, and as the temperature drops, they have to wait through the process of natural selection to develop a thicker coat of fur, humans, because we have self-conscious awareness, can say, I am cold, and we can do something about it. Within an hour, we can sew ourselves a coat of fur, as opposed to having to wait, 1,000,000 years and 1,000 generations later to, have developed a thicker coat of fur through evolution. So in a sense, we've sort of broken away from the process of natural selection. Humans are not going to evolve anymore. Anyone who speculates, like, what will humans be in 500 years? Like, we'll have 3 years and we'll be taller and, whatever they project is silly. Humans aren't evolving. All the other animals might, but humans won't, because we can adjust ourselves to suit any environment, any climate that we visit. We can alter. We can alter ourselves, or through technology, we can make ourselves a suit so we can go walk on the moon, for instance. Itself, how it reproduces, etc. Moreover, if I took a cat, or a kitten rather, away from its mother at birth and raised it to humans, it's still going to grow up to meow, suggesting that it's not a learned behavior, but a genetically preconceived reflex. So, according to the science of sociobiology, any behavior that's universal, so for instance, the fact that all cats meow would suggest that somewhere in a cat's brain is a series of neural connections that generates that particular behavior, meowing. And were we to damage that part of the cat's brain, it would probably lose its ability somehow, just like with humans. If there are language parts of our brain that if damaged, we lose our language abilities. So any trait that's universal, it suggests that there's a part of the brain that generates that behavior, and then that there are genes in our chromosomes that are responsible for creating that series of connections in the brain. So I applied that notion to the fact that every human culture from the beginning of our species has believed in some form of a spiritual reality. That every culture has created a religion, has created a series of myths, all based on a belief in some higher power, some higher plane. So, applying that notion to this science of sociobiology, what it suggested to me was, perhaps in fact, humans are genetically hardwired to believe in some type of a spiritual reality. And that just like we're a linguistic animal, we have parts of our brain that make us, that give, here was an ideology which seemed to be tried and tested. And whereas faith offered, different religions offered various tales and myths that you had to you had to accept on blind faith and could never really be tested, with the workings of science, I flip a switch and the lights go on. So it seemed to be pretty well tested. And moreover, none of the religions I had studied ever gave us any real technology. I mean, other than the tales which we're supposed to believe in, regardless of what religion you believe in, none of them have ever offered us something that either, a medicine that extended our lives or cured a disease. There were blessings that were supposed to cure diseases, but really until the age of science, the mortality rate for humans all across the globe was like half of what it is now. So I put my faith in science, and as I did more and more research, I found myself coming up with the science of what's called sociobiology, which is sort of a modern day twist on Darwinism. And basically what sociobiology suggests, it's just modern genetics, which is that basically any trait that is universal to any species has to have a genetic component. So for instance, the fact that all dogs bark, or all cats meow, or all beavers build dams, or all honeybees build hexagonal-shaped honeycombs, or basically any species that you study has a very specific way of how it eats, how it grooms.
Tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got interested into this subject.
Well, I think I became interested in the subject when I was a young child and I first conceived of the notion of death. that basically myself and my mommy and my daddy and everyone I knew or loved was going to die and be buried in the dirt. And it was quite devastating to me to come to that realization. So pretty much since then, though my quest got more sophisticated as I got older, pretty much since that time, I wanted to get to the bottom because of, is there a spiritual reality? Is death indeed the final end, or is it a new beginning? Is there a spiritual realm, as so many people had, spoken of? I grew up in New York City. It's a melting pot of cultures and religions, and didn't matter which friend's home I was at, whether they were Jewish or Christian or Muslim or Hindu, because I think I had friends of every faith, more or less. They all prayed at dinner time before a meal, or, spoke of God in some way, praised God, etc. There was always mention as a child, and I was like, all right, everybody believes in this big boss up in the sky, so there was no reason for me not to believe. And as I got older, I questioned more, and then I decided that of all the, let's say, faiths out there, of all the different paradigms that were offered, the one that I felt made the most sense was the scientific paradigm.